captures how Kendrick Akins popped the big question.
He had a shirt on that said, "Dominique, will you, marry me?" on his shirt. And he gave her the ring, kneeled down on his knees and gave her the ring. And then 3 days later, he turned around and killed my daughter.
In less than a week, Akins went from doting fiancé to accused murderer.
He promised me he was going to take care of my daughter. He was going to cherish my daughter. He was going to love her. He was going to be there for her, and he lied. He lied. He killed my daughter.
What would you do if the person you trusted most, the one who promised to love you forever, became the person who took your life? Imagine the heartbreak of having your dreams shattered in the blink of an eye. This is the tragic story of Dominique Jefferson, a woman whose life was full of promise, love, and hope, only to be ended in a brutal act of betrayal. On Christmas Eve 2019, Dominique thought she had found her happily ever after. Kendrick Akins, her boyfriend of just a few months, dropped to one knee and proposed to her. It was a moment of pure joy, a promise of a future filled with love, family, and stability. She had 3 children, and she believed this was the moment that would secure the life she had always dreamed of, a life full of security and love. But little did Dominique know, this was only the beginning of her nightmare. In the days that followed, the dream of a perfect future would quickly unravel. What appeared to be a fairy tale proposal would soon turn into a nightmare that no one could have predicted. Behind the surface of love, lies, jealousy, and control began to fester. A relationship that had seemed like a dream turned toxic, and what should have been a life of joy quickly turned into a deadly tragedy. But what caused Kendrick to turn from loving fiancé to violent killer? What went wrong in those 3 short days between the proposal and Dominique's death? Was there something sinister in his past that Dominique never saw? Why did it all escalate so quickly? Before we dive into the heartbreaking details of this chilling story, I have one simple request. Hit that subscribe button right now. Join us here at Silent Crimes HQ as we unravel the story of Dominique Jefferson, because the truth is darker than you might think and you won't want to miss a second of it. Trust me, this is one of those stories that will make you question everything you know about love, trust, and betrayal. Dominique Jefferson was a woman full of life, love, and hope for the future. At 33 years old, she had already experienced the joys and struggles of motherhood, raising 3 children on her own. Known for her vibrant personality and warm heart, Dominique was the kind of person who believed in the beauty of love and the importance of family. Her friends and family often described her as someone who made others feel seen, valued, and loved. She had dreams of finding stability and creating a safe, loving environment for her children. A dream that seemed to come within reach when she met Kendrick Akins. Kendrick Akins was a 42-year-old man with a complex and troubling past. When he first crossed paths with Dominique, he appeared to be the charming, loving man she had been searching for. He promised her the world, offering her a future that seemed so perfect, so full of possibility. Kendrick quickly became everything Dominique thought she wanted in a partner. But behind his smooth words and promises of love, there was a darker side to Kendrick. One that was hidden beneath the surface, masked by his apparent devotion. Kendrick was a man with a history of violence. Despite his claims of a fresh start, his past was filled with brushes with the law, including charges of assault and a violent criminal record. But Dominique, eager to believe in the possibility of a better life, didn't see the red flags. To her, Kendrick was the man who would give her the future she had always dreamed of. A future she believed she had finally found after years of hardship. He proposed to her on Christmas Eve, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. But as the days passed, cracks began to appear in the fairy tale. Dominique soon began to realize that Kendrick's behavior wasn't as loving as she had believed. His jealousy, anger, and controlling tendencies started to show. Yet she didn't want to accept that the man she thought she would marry could be someone capable of hurting her. The relationship turned volatile, and what had started as an engagement full of promise quickly spiraled out of control. Christmas Eve 2019. It should have been a night of joy, a night to remember forever. Kendrick Akins had planned everything down to the last detail. His proposal to Dominique Jefferson was going to be the moment that solidified their future together. The holiday season, full of warmth and love, seemed like the perfect time for such a monumental gesture. For Dominique, this was the dream she had been waiting for. The proposal was everything she had ever wanted. Kendrick, who had promised her a better life, now was asking her to build that life with him forever. She said yes, her heart full of hope, believing that her life was finally taking the turn she had always longed for, a stable, loving family. For her, this engagement symbolized a new beginning, a fresh start, a chance to build a future for her children and herself. The ring he gave her glittered just like the future she imagined. But little did Dominic know, this seemingly perfect moment would be the beginning of her worst nightmare. The joy of the proposal was fleeting. Kendrick had a way of making everything feel perfect when it was just the two of them, but once they stepped outside their bubble, the cracks in their relationship began to show. His controlling nature, which Dominic had overlooked, began to grow stronger. The honeymoon phase was already beginning to fade. For Dominic, the proposal had been an affirmation of the love they shared, but for Kendrick it was about control. An attempt to lock her into a life he could control, a life that would revolve around his needs and desires. The signs were subtle at first. Kendrick would often question where Dominic was, who she was with, and what she was doing. The jealousy crept in, disguised as concern. But for Dominic, the love she thought they shared overshadowed her doubts. She brushed it off, telling herself that every relationship had its challenges. After all, he had just asked her to marry him. He loved her, right? The engagement that was supposed to be a celebration of love soon became a battleground for dominance and power. The proposal, which should have been the beginning of a beautiful chapter, was now a symbol of a relationship that would take a dark and tragic turn. Kendrick's charming exterior slowly faded, revealing a man with a hidden agenda. Someone who wasn't ready for the life Dominic dreamed of. And yet Dominic still hoped. She hoped that the promise of a better future could outweigh the uncomfortable feeling she began to sense in her gut. But how could she know that the very man she trusted to protect her would soon become the one to take it all away? How could she foresee that the promise of a forever she had dreamed about would be shattered in the most unimaginable way? Kendrick Akins had proposed to Dominic, but in doing so he had sealed the fate of both of their lives. In the days that followed, a toxic pattern began to take hold. What was once a dream now felt more like a nightmare, and the danger was lurking, waiting to strike. The joy of Christmas Eve quickly turned to a haunting memory, a moment of happiness that would soon be overshadowed by an act of violence no one could have predicted. The days following the engagement were a strange mixture of excitement and unease. On the outside, Dominic and Kendrick appeared like any couple enjoying the bliss of their new engagement. The future looked bright. There were wedding plans to be made, dreams to be realized. But beneath the surface, a storm was brewing. Kendrick's controlling tendencies were becoming harder to ignore, and Dominic was starting to feel the weight of the red flags she had previously overlooked. In the early days of their engagement, Kendrick seemed like the perfect partner, attentive, affectionate, and eager to please. But that facade soon began to crack. He started questioning Dominic's every move, becoming overly protective and increasingly possessive. His jealousy flared at the smallest of things: who she was with, where she was going, and why she didn't respond to his texts immediately. It wasn't love, it was control. Dominic, still caught up in the whirlwind of a fresh engagement, tried to brush it off. "He's just protective," she told herself. "He loves me." But deep down she knew something wasn't quite right. There were moments when Kendrick's temper would flare unexpectedly, moments that left her questioning whether this was really the future she wanted. Yet the thought of calling off the engagement felt impossible. She had dreamed of a stable family life, of raising her children in a safe and loving home. How could she walk away now? The tension between them grew in those final days. Arguments became more frequent, and what should have been a joyful time of planning their future together now felt heavy and fraught with anxiety. Kendrick, frustrated with the lack of control, began to push harder, becoming more insistent on having things his way. Every disagreement felt like it could spiral into something more, but Dominic, ever hopeful, believed that they would work through it, just as every couple did. However, Kendrick's behavior wasn't just the result of normal relationship stress. His past, a history filled with violence and anger, was slowly resurfacing. His criminal record, which Dominic had never fully understood, began to cast a dark shadow over everything. The promises he made to her of a better life started to feel like lies. But Dominic, trapped in the illusion of their perfect engagement, couldn't bring herself to acknowledge the truth. She still loved him despite the warning signs. In these final days, there were moments when Dominic felt like a stranger in her own life. She couldn't escape the nagging feeling that she was walking on eggshells. But she tried to ignore it, telling herself that this was just part of the process, part of the growing pains of any relationship. She didn't want to believe that the man she was supposed to marry could be capable of hurting her. But on the inside she was slowly suffocating. The last few days of their engagement should have been filled with excitement. Dreams of the wedding, thoughts of a new life. Instead, they were marked by escalating tension and the heavy realization that Dominic was no longer sure about the future she had so eagerly agreed to just days before. Kendrick's anger was becoming unpredictable, and Dominic could no longer pretend that things were fine. The moment of joy that came with the proposal was slipping away, and a darker reality was taking its place. Little did Dominic know the countdown to a tragic end had already begun. The final days of what should have been a joyful engagement were now marred by suspicion, fear, and uncertainty. And as the tension mounted, the inevitable was drawing closer. Soon, it would all come to a devastating head. January 4, 2020, should have been another ordinary evening. But for Dominic Jefferson and Kendrick Akins, it was a night that would change everything forever. What started as an argument, a typical disagreement between a couple, quickly escalated into a violent confrontation that ended Dominic's life in a way no one could have anticipated. The evening began like many others. Kendrick had come to Dominic's apartment to fix her car, which had been acting up. But instead of a helpful gesture, the evening soon turned into a volatile interaction, with the simmering tensions between them reaching their breaking point. Kendrick, frustrated and angry over Dominic's refusal to let him control every aspect of her life, began to lash out. The arguments that had been brewing for days now erupted with fury. As Dominic and Kendrick argued, the conflict spiraled out of control. At this point, Dominic had grown tired of the constant pressure and emotional turmoil. She was done trying to placate him, done with the doubts and the fears. She wanted him to leave, but Kendrick wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. The situation took a darker turn when Dominic, desperate for some space, shouted at Kendrick to leave her alone. But Kendrick was not willing to walk away. His temper, already volatile, flared, and in an instant, everything changed. Dominic tried to distance herself, but Kendrick followed her, his rage uncontrollable. The tension between them crackled in the air, and before Dominic could react, Kendrick pulled out a gun. She froze for a moment, perhaps not fully comprehending what was happening. And then in a heartbeat, Kendrick fired. The bullet hit Dominic in the chest and she collapsed to the ground. In that moment, everything she had ever hoped for, everything she had dreamed of with Kendrick was shattered. The man she had trusted, the man she thought would build a life with her, had just taken it all away. She was left there, bleeding on the ground, her life slipping away. Kendrick, realizing the gravity of what he had done, didn't stay to help her. Instead, he fled the scene, taking Dominic's phone with him, leaving her to die in the cold, silent night. The woman who had dreamed of a loving family, of a future with Kendrick by her side, was now gone. Her children were left without their mother, and her family was left to mourn the woman they lost so suddenly and violently. As the investigation into the crime began, it was revealed that Kendrick's actions were not spontaneous. They were the result of months, perhaps years, of simmering rage and control. The same man who had proposed to Dominic on Christmas Eve was now the man who had murdered her. His love turned to violent obsession. For Dominic, there was no chance to survive that night. But for Kendrick, the consequences of his actions were only beginning. What followed would be an investigation, a search for justice, and the unraveling of a man whose violent history caught up with him in the most tragic way. Dominic's life was stolen in an instant, leaving her loved ones devastated and broken. The proposal that should have marked the beginning of a beautiful future had instead led to the tragic end of a life full of untold potential. The man who once promised to protect her was now her killer, and the nightmare of that fateful night would haunt everyone who knew her. The cold, unforgiving night that claimed Dominic Jefferson's life was just the beginning of a long, painful search for answers. As the police arrived at the scene of the crime, the gravity of the situation became clear. Dominic was found lifeless in the parking lot, her body still warm, her hopes for the future stolen by the one person who was supposed to protect her. But the question remained, who could have done this and why? Dominic's family was left in shock, struggling to comprehend how such a horrific act could happen. Her children, already robbed of the stability they deserved, now faced the devastating reality of growing up without their mother. Her loved ones rallied together, determined to find justice for the woman they had lost too soon. The investigation began almost immediately. Detectives quickly learned of Kendrick Akins, the man who had proposed to Dominic just days before her death. But as they delved deeper into his background, a disturbing picture emerged. Kendrick was no stranger to violence. His past was littered with violent offenses, including assault charges, and he had a history of abusive behavior in relationships. It became clear that Dominic was not the first woman Kendrick had tried to control. He had a pattern of manipulation and aggression that had been buried beneath his charming exterior. But even with his violent history, Kendrick had disappeared. He had fled the scene shortly after shooting Dominic, leaving behind a trail of destruction. His actions were calculated, and it was clear he had planned to disappear without a trace. But the detectives weren't about to let him slip through their fingers. They began piecing together the evidence, speaking with witnesses and following every lead they could find. As the search for Kendrick continued, the investigation revealed shocking details. Kendrick had taken Dominic's phone with him when he fled the scene, trying to erase any trace of his involvement. But his attempts to cover his tracks were futile. Detectives traced his movements, pieced together his whereabouts, and discovered that Kendrick's behavior after the murder was far from the remorseful actions of a man who had just killed the love of his life. Instead, it was the cold and calculated behavior of a man who believed he could outrun the consequences of his actions. While Kendrick remained on the run, Dominic's family continued to mourn, yet they refused to let the memory of her life fade. They held on to the belief that justice would prevail, that the man who had taken Dominic from them would not escape the consequences of his actions. Finally, days later, Kendrick turned himself in, but it wasn't an act of remorse. It was an acknowledgement that the walls were closing in. The authorities had tracked him down, and he knew there was no place left to hide. His arrest brought a bittersweet sense of relief to Dominic's family. They would finally get the chance to confront the man who had stolen their loved one's life. But the investigation didn't end there. As the case continued to unfold, more chilling details emerged. Kendrick's violent past, his obsession with Dominic, and his complete lack of remorse all pointed to one undeniable truth. He was a man capable of unimaginable violence. The man who had once promised Dominic a future together was the same man who had destroyed it in an instant. Dominic's family now faced the difficult task of making sense of the senseless. The investigation had brought them closer to the truth, but it could never undo the pain of losing her. The search for justice had only just begun. But for Kendrick, the days of hiding from the consequences of his actions were over. And for Dominic's loved ones, the fight for justice would continue until the very end. The search for justice had led to Kendrick Akins' arrest, but the real battle was just beginning. Now, the stage was set for a courtroom showdown that would see Kendrick face the consequences of his actions. The trial was not only about determining his guilt or innocence, but also about confronting the ugly truths of his violent past and the devastating impact his actions had on Dominic's family. The courtroom was filled with tension as the trial began. Kendrick sat in the defendant's chair, seemingly calm, but his stoic exterior couldn't mask the weight of the charges against him. Dominic's family, including her children, were there, their hearts heavy with grief and hope. For them, this was not just a legal battle. It was the final chance to honor Dominic's memory and ensure that Kendrick would never hurt anyone again. The prosecution's case was powerful, laying out the evidence that Kendrick had shot and killed Dominic in cold blood. They presented the sequence of events leading up to the murder, showing how Kendrick's possessiveness, jealousy, and abusive tendencies had fueled the fatal confrontation. Witnesses who had seen the couple's volatile relationship testified, revealing how Kendrick's temper and violent history had been masked by his initial charm. The prosecution also revealed the chilling details of Kendrick's past. His criminal history, which included assaults and violent outbursts. This wasn't the first time Kendrick had used violence to control a woman. It was a pattern that had repeated itself over the years. Dominic had been the latest victim in a long line of relationships where Kendrick's rage was the driving force. The prosecution painted a clear picture of a man who had preyed on Dominic's vulnerability, only to betray her in the most horrific way. But it wasn't just the evidence that made this trial so difficult. The emotional toll on Dominic's family was evident as they relived the nightmare of her death, step by painful step. Her children, who had lost their mother in an instant, had to face the man who had torn their world apart. Every moment was a reminder of the love that had been stolen from them, and the pain of knowing they would never see Dominic again. On the other side of the courtroom, Kendrick's defense team worked tirelessly to try and minimize his actions. They painted a different picture of him, one of a man who had been overwhelmed by emotions and who had acted out of a sense of desperation. They tried to frame the incident as an unfortunate tragedy, an argument that had spiraled out of control. But the jury wasn't fooled. The cold, calculated nature of Kendrick's actions and his complete lack of remorse spoke louder than any defense they could mount. As the trial progressed, it became clear that Kendrick's defense was not enough to counter the overwhelming evidence. His attempts to downplay the murder and avoid the full consequences of his actions fell flat. The testimony from Dominic's family, the witnesses, and the expert witnesses all pointed to one undeniable fact. Kendrick had murdered Dominic in a moment of rage, and he had done it knowing exactly what he was doing. The jury deliberated, but the verdict was inevitable. Kendrick Akins was found guilty of murder, and the room fell silent as the judge prepared to deliver the sentence. Dominic's family, while still grieving, breathed a collective sigh of relief. They had fought for justice and it had been served. The judge sentenced Kendrick to life in prison without the possibility of parole. It was a sentence that would ensure he would never harm anyone again. For Dominic's family, it was a small victory in the midst of unimaginable loss. But it was a victory nonetheless. They had seen the man who had destroyed their world held accountable for his actions, and in that moment, they knew that Dominic's legacy would live on, through the fight for justice, through the love she had shared with them, and through the lessons learned from her tragic death. As Kendrick was led away in handcuffs, Dominic's family left the courtroom, their hearts heavy but resolute. The trial had been a painful chapter in their journey, but it was one step closer to healing. They knew that justice had been served, but they also knew that nothing could ever bring back the woman they had lost. The trial was over, but the fight for Dominic's memory, and the fight to ensure that no one else would fall victim to Kendrick's violence, was far from finished. The courtroom had fallen silent, the gavel echoing in the air, but for Dominic Jefferson's family, the real weight of the trial's conclusion was only just beginning to settle in. Kendrick Akins was behind bars, his fate sealed, but the void left by Dominic's death was one that no verdict could ever fill. As they walked away from the courthouse, her family was forced to face a world forever changed. One without her laughter, her love, and her unyielding spirit. For her children, the loss was unimaginable. They had lost more than just a mother. They had lost their protector, their guide, their constant source of love. Dominic had been their world, and now they were left to navigate a future without her. The holidays that once held memories of joy and celebration would forever be tinged with sorrow. Birthdays, family gatherings, and milestones, they would now be met with the empty ache of her absence. But her family refused to let her memory fade. They gathered together, supporting each other as they had always done, but now their bond was marked by grief. They held on to the love Dominic had given them, determined to honor her by ensuring that her children grew up knowing the strength, warmth, and resilience she had shown every single day. Her absence in their lives would never be filled, but her legacy, her love for her family, her hope for a better future, would endure. Friends of Dominic rallied together, creating foundations in her honor, dedicating themselves to spreading awareness about domestic violence, and helping others who might be in the same situation she had been. Her death had not been in vain. Even in death, Dominic continued to inspire change, offering a voice to those who felt they had none, giving strength to those who were afraid to speak out. For her family, Dominic's story became a testament to the power of love, the importance of family, and the need for justice in the face of tragedy. Though they could never erase the pain of losing her, they took solace in knowing that Kendrick would never harm anyone again. They would continue to fight for the change she would have wanted, ensuring that her memory lived on, not just as the woman they lost, but as the woman who had left behind a legacy that could never be forgotten. If Dominic Jefferson's story has left you shaken and moved, don't let it fade away. Every day, countless others face the same struggles, the same dangers, and the same heart-wrenching tragedies. Her story isn't just one of loss. It's a reminder that we must stand together and speak out against abuse, injustice, and violence. If you believe that her legacy deserves to live on, subscribe to Silent Crimes HQ. Your support means more than you know. It helps keep stories like Dominic's alive and ensures that the fight for justice and awareness continues. Don't let her voice be silenced. Share this story, speak up, and be a part of the change. Make sure you hit that notification bell so you never miss another story that could make a difference. Justice isn't just about what happens in the courtroom, it's about what we do with the truth once we know it. Subscribe now, and together, let's make sure that the memory of Dominic Jefferson, and the countless others like her, never fades.